partners in trust, protecting their land for future generations. U.S. soybean farmers are the most sustainable in the world. The U.S. Soy Sustainability Assurance Protocol is one of the ways that U.S. farmers demonstrate their commitment to sustainability and continuous improvement. Using innovation like biotechnology for seed development and precision farming through GPS, U.S. farmers increased soy production by 96%, while consistently reducing our environmental footprint. In 30 years, the world must feed 9 billion people, serving more than 80 countries around the world. This is U.S. soy, and it is making a difference.
Selamat pagi, good morning, everyone. Bapak Ibu sekalian, saya Ibnu Edi Wiono, Country Director for USEC di Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak, thank you so much for joining with us in the second day of Indonesia Layer Nutrition and Feed Technology Conference. I know we start a bit early today. We start 30 minutes earlier than yesterday. So I think everyone is still wrapping up their breakfast, or maybe some of them on the way to the office. And then once arrived, they will start joining our webinar, which is fine. And thank you so much. Also, we already have Dr. Corver come online with us today. I know it's like 13 hours different from Indonesia in terms of Jakarta time and then Canadian time. So in the second day, we will have like, I think, 7 speakers, 4 in the morning session, and then we will have about an hour break for lunch and praying, and then we continue at 1 p.m. To listen to another 3 speakers. I hope you can enjoy the conference today, and then stay with us till the end of this conference. And then for the housekeeping, I just want to remind everyone, Bapak Ibu sekalian, please type in your questions in the Q&A widget, not in the chat box, because it will be more easy. It will be easier for us, for the moderator, to look at the questions if you post it in the Q&A widget, not in the chat box, because in the chat box it can be mixed with comments and also any other sentence that not a questions. So I appreciate if you can do that for us to help you address the questions that you raise in this conference. And then today I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Doc Corver. Dr. Doc Corver will discuss about calcium, phosphorus, and phytates for layers. I don't have to read again his CV because he already I think his short bio already addressed by Dr. Nenet yesterday. But I think he is is a professor, expert in layer from Alberta University, Canada. So I think without further ado, Dr. Doc Corber, please come online. Time and screen is yours. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Doug Corver, and I'm a poultry nutritionist at the University of Alberta. And I'm here to talk to you today about calcium, phosphorus, and phytates for laying hens. I'd like to thank US SEC for inviting me here to speak to you today, and I hope it's of benefit to you. So we know that calcium and phosphorus are important in laying hens. Calcium in particular is important for bone structure. And in fact, over 99% of the calcium in the body of the chicken is in the form of bones. There are many other functions, however, at tissue and cellular levels that are very important, but most of the calcium in the body is in fact in the form of bones. And of course, in laying hens, we also see an important role of calcium in eggshell formation. Phosphorus is also primarily found in bone, with about 80 to 85% of body phosphorus in the bone, and there are many other functions of phosphorus as well. But for the purposes of today's talk, I'm really going to be focusing on bone and eggshell as we talk about calcium and phosphorus and how phytase can be used to liberate calcium and especially phosphorus from the phytate molecule in plant ingredients. Now, because calcium and phosphorus are so important in the laying hen, I like to think of this part of my talk as how to make a chicken skeleton. Now, in order to understand the chicken skeleton, we need to know about the structure of bones in the skeleton. And so chickens have various types of bone tissues. The first type is cortical bone, and this is a type of structural bone. And it's this outer component in the, if you look on the outside of the bone, it's this shell that forms most of the structure, most of the strength of the bone. And so this is the first part of the structural bone components of laying hens. And of course, this is a humerus, this is a wing bone, but all the bones in the body would have cortical bone. Now, if we look at the second type of structural bone, we see trabecular bone, and trabecular bone is the small struts inside the component, the cortical shell. And if you've ever taken a look inside a pneumatic bone or an air-filled bone, you can see these trabecular struts. And these struts give strength to the bone and still allow the bird to have a light skeleton. And that's an important adaptation for flight in birds. Now, the interesting thing about structural bone is that as the pullet is growing, she deposits structural bone. But as she approaches sexual maturity, in about 10 to 14 days before an individual hen lays her first egg, she will actually stop forming structural bone. So she will stop forming cortical bone. She will stop forming trabecular bone. And instead, she forms a third type of bone that we'll talk about in a moment. But you see that if we look at this cross section of a femur in a laying hen, we can see that there are thick cortical structures. So the wall on the outside of the bone is very thick and very strong. We can see trabecular struts within that bone tissue. So these are the trabecula that give strength to the bone. Now, as the hen approaches sexual maturity, she deposits a different type of bone. So she stops depositing structural bone, cortical and trabecular bone, but she develops a new type of bone. And this is called medullary bone. And this is bone that is formed as birds approach sexual maturity. It continues to form throughout the laying cycle to the end of the production cycle. And this bone is intended to support eggshell formation. So it's intended to support, provide a source of calcium for eggshell formation, particularly when the hen is not able to consume calcium, but she's still forming an eggshell. Now, the interesting thing about this type of bone is that it is able to be deposited as long as the hen is actively laying eggs. So she no longer deposits structural bone, but she can deposit medullary bone and then take it up and deposit it and take it up as needed throughout the laying cycle on a day-to-day basis. And so if we look again at a cross-section of the bone, we can see the cortical bone on the outside. We can see a little bit of a trabecular strut here. And now these really dark staining little specks of bone tissue are the bits of medullary bone. And if we look at an old hen, this is a bone that has been ashed. So all of the organic material has been removed. Basically, the bone has been burned. And we can see that the medullary bone forms this spongy structure on the interior of long bones. So if we look at the structure of a hen bone, so this is a hen at first egg. I should have pointed out that the first picture was from a pullet. We know that this bird was not sexually mature because she did not have any ovarian development. And so immature bird, no medullary bone. If we look at a bird that is mature, so this bird was euthanized after she laid her first egg, we still see fairly thick cortical bone structures. We see some trabecular struts throughout, but now we've got a thick layer of these specks of medullary bone lining the surface of the structural bone. Now, this bone, again, is intended as a support or an extra supply of calcium, particularly in the dark phase when the hens are not eating, but they're still forming an eggshell, and they need calcium in order to make that eggshell. So if we look at the composition of an eggshell, we know that a typical eggshell weighs about 5.5 grams, and of that, about 2.2 grams is calcium. So each eggshell that is produced by the hen requires about 2.2 grams of calcium. Now that's actually quite a lot because it's about 10% of the total calcium in the skeleton of the bird. So every time the hen lays an egg, she is excreting the equivalent of 10% of the total body calcium. And just a few other facts. The majority of the eggshell is made up of calcium carbonate. There's a little bit of phosphorus and a little bit of magnesium in it as well. But the shell is primarily made of calcium carbonate. Now, I mentioned that the hen puts out the equivalent of about 10% of her total body calcium reserves with each egg. Now, not all of that calcium is coming from the bones. So about 60 to 80% of the eggshell calcium is derived directly from the diet on shell forming days. So the hen is consuming feed, she absorbs calcium from the feed, the calcium enters the bloodstream and goes directly to the shell gland, and the shell gland takes that calcium from the blood that originally came directly from the diet. Now that also means that between 20 and 40% of the eggshell calcium does come from the bones. And so this is a normal physiological feature. This is expected to happen. And it's the reason for the medullary bone to act as that calcium supply when the hen is not able to absorb dietary calcium, for example, during the night. Now, we mentioned that only medullary bone could be deposited while the hen was laying eggs. So once the hen enters production, she can only form medullary bone. The challenge is that when the bone is mobilized, the bird does not just mobilize the medullary bone. It is also possible to mobilize structural bone, so cortical and trabecular bone tissue. The other challenge that this creates is the reason the bone is mobilized is because of the calcium content of the bone. But when the bone calcium is liberated, it also releases phosphorus from the bone. And the problem is that the body doesn't need extra phosphorus to support eggshell formation. And so that extra phosphorus is released from the bones and it has to be excreted in order to maintain normal blood phosphorus levels. Now, research has shown that if there is a greater proportion of eggshell coming from the diet, directly from the diet, the eggshell quality tends to be a little bit better. And so if we look at that, the reason for that happening is that this is a cross-section of bone tissue, and we can see that there is cortical bone up in the top left of the picture. That's that whitish or grayish material. There is medullary bone, and this is the very dark blue staining material. And you can also see the arrows pointing to cells that are called osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are the cells that break down bone and release the calcium and, of course, phosphorus into the blood supply. So when the hen needs calcium and she's not getting it from the diet, she can mobilize bone using these osteoclasts, and she can use the calcium from eggshell formation. Now, these osteoclasts that are pointed out with the arrows are contacting medullary bone. So those osteoclasts will mobilize medullary bone. But we also see some osteoclasts that are up against structural bone, cortical bone. And the osteoclasts are not particular. They will mobilize bone tissue, whether it's medullary bone or cortical bone or trabecular bone, medullary bone or structural bone. And so over time, there's a gradual loss of of trabecular bone and cortical bone. And over time, there's an overall loss of structural bone because that bone is not replaced as long as the hens are in production. So if we look at what happens on a 24-hour basis, and on the y-axis, we have the amount of shell mineral. So this is the gain in shell mineral that we see over a 24-hour period. And we're going to assume that it takes approximately 24 hours for a hen to lay an egg. So if we start assuming that there's a 24-hour length of time required to form an egg, we notice that for the first 4 hours after ovulation, the hen is not depositing any calcium. So the ovum has been released from the ovary. It's traveling down the oviduct. The albumin is being added. The shell membrane is being added. And then after about 4 hours, it reaches the shell gland. And this is when the calcium is deposited. And so if we put some arbitrary times on this diagram, so we say arbitrarily that if the hen lays an egg at 10 o'clock in the morning, she ovulates, it takes some time for the ovulated follicle to reach the shell gland. And then after about 4 hours since the previous egg was laid, she starts depositing calcium. Now, let's say that the lights are turned off at around 8 p.m. and the hens will anticipate this. And so they will increase their feed intake to have a supply of calcium in order to support egg formation. But even if they do that, there's a portion of the dark period when the lights are off and the birds are not consuming new feed where the calcium eventually runs out, okay? So by about 6 hours, the digestive tract may be empty, and so the bird is required, she needs to use bone calcium to support egg formation, because most of the egg formation actually takes place during the dark period when the hen is not consuming feed. And again, she might be absorbing feed for the early part of this period, but by the end, if we're only feeding small particle calcium, she has to mobilize the bones. And even if we're doing a good job of managing calcium supply, there will likely be some use of bone calcium. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the lights come on, the hens start eating again, and they start consuming feed. They have a dietary supply of calcium again, coming directly from the diet and going to the shell gland. So at 10 o'clock in the morning, 24 hours after the previous egg, the hen lays her next egg. And at this point then, the hen has a period where she's not forming an eggshell, she's consuming feed, and she is able to redeposit the medullary bone. So again, the bone tissue use in the dark period can be medullary bone, but it can also be structural bone. The bone deposition that takes place is only the formation of medullary bone. And so again, we can see how over time, this can lead to a loss of structural bone. And so if we look at, in this case, this is a 67-week-old hen, and we see a couple of important features in this figure. We notice that the cortical shell is very, very thin, and this means it's more susceptible to breaking. We see some trabecular struts in this structure, but they're very thin and very weak. And so again, that provides less strength to the bone. The other important feature is that there's actually lots of medullary bone present. And so there's a diffusion or a disbursement of the medullary bone within the marrow space. And basically it provides less protection for the structural bone. So as the birds get older and older, they utilize more structural bone because it's less protected by that layer of medullary bone. And so the osteoclasts have more access to the trabecular bone. And so what can happen over time is osteoporosis or caged layer fatigue. And this is a loss of structural bone mass. It can lead to vertebral breaks or long bone breaks. Healing can occur. So if we look at this bone, this is a humerus bone, a wing bone from a laying hen. It's been broken and it's healed. It's healed improperly. But while that bone is healing, that bird is stressed. It needs calcium for bone repair, and that hen is probably out of production. If it's a vertebral break or if it's a leg break, that hen may be unable to reach feed and water, and so they can starve out. Now, the important thing to remember is this break or this loss of structural bone can happen even as the amount of medullary bone is increasing. So it's not simply a matter of the hens are running out of calcium, it's that over time, they're being forced to use a greater proportion of their bone calcium, their structural bone calcium, and that weakens the bone. And so if we can manage the birds such that there's a greater proportion of the calcium being put into the eggshell coming not from the bones, but from the diet, will reduce the stress, will reduce the mobilization of structural bone in the long term over a production cycle. Now, the other interesting fact is that after peak production, so after the birds reach peak production, they have a relatively consistent ability to deposit shell. So even as the eggs get bigger, the shells can get thinner, and in particular, as the eggs get very large towards the end of a long production cycle, we can see a substantial decrease in shell quality. And what we found, we've done some experiments, but what we found is that modern laying hen strains generally prioritize eggshell at the expense of the skeleton. And so we may see good quality shells throughout production, but the skeleton may be at risk. And so just because we're not seeing eggshell qualities does not mean that the birds have high quality skeletons. Okay, so what can we do to manage calcium and phosphorus supply? What can we do to manage the birds in order to prevent or minimize the risk of these bone quality problems? Well, body weight at placement is incredibly important. If our birds are too small, they may not have the ability to deposit sufficient medullary bone because bone size is going to be related to body size. And so larger birds will have larger bones. They will have more structural bone reserves. They will also have more medullary bone reserves. And again, I recognize that in the Indonesian market, there's probably a push towards smaller birds, but it's important to make sure that these birds then have sufficient medullary bone reserves in order to sustain egg production and not have to utilize as much of their structural bone reserves. People ask me, should they feed a pre-lay diet or not? Pre-lay diets can be very effective, but we need to remember that there is a limited time before the first egg. So before an individual hen lays her first egg, she can only deposit medullary bone beginning about 10 to 14 days prior to her first egg. And so if we provide extra calcium too soon, she's not going to be able to use it. She's just going to excrete it. If we provide extra calcium too late, she's already going to be producing eggs, and it will take a long time to build up those medullary bone reserves because she needs the calcium for eggshell formation. So pre-lay diets can be used. They should only be used for a very brief period before the onset of lay, and they certainly should not be used past 5% production. And if you've got a very uniform flock, you can probably switch at even a lower production rate. Now, pre-lay diets are not necessary 10 to 14 days before the first egg and accomplish the same sort of thing. Now, the reason we don't want to feed pre-lay diets for a long period of time as the birds come in.
Recording in progress.
Birds will go from very low production, so around 5 or 6% production at 18 weeks of age, according to the management guide, up to perhaps 83% production within 2 weeks. So as birds come into production, very few of the birds will have that high calcium demand for eggshell production, but very, very quickly, the rest of the flock will come into production and they will have those needs. So if we're switching the diet to a high calcium diet as birds are starting to come in, or preferably before the birds are starting to come in, and not keeping them on that moderate calcium prelay diet beyond about 5% production. This is when we'll be able to meet the needs of most of the birds. So how do we manage calcium and phosphorus supply? Well, there's the typical things that we would normally expect to do. We look at calcium level. We don't want to oversupply calcium. We don't want to undersupply calcium. We change the calcium to phosphorus ratio with age. We typically increase calcium and reduce the available phosphorus level to create a wider calcium to phosphorus ratio. Now, the problem or the solution to the problem of shell quality or bone quality is not just simply increasing the amount of calcium that we feed to the birds, because as we increase the amount of calcium in the diet,